They thought he was just another broken soldier, another casualty of war sitting in a psychiatric ward, staring at walls, talking to ghosts that weren't there. The doctors had seen it 1,000 times before. But what they didn't know was that the man in room 217 wasn't like the others. And when that door opened 3 days later, everything they believed about him would shatter in an instant. The VA hospital in Northern Virginia ran like most government facilities. Overworked staff, endless paperwork, patients who blurred together after the first 100 faces. Room 217 had been occupied for 72 hours by a man who hadn't spoken a single word since his admission. No family had called. No friends had visited. His file was thin, vague, redacted in places that made the intake nurse frown. But she'd seen plenty of redacted files before. They all meant the same thing. Trauma. Something too dark to write down in full sentences. She clipped the chart back onto the door and moved on to the next room without a second thought. Inside, the man sat on the edge of his bed, hands resting on his knees, back straight despite the exhaustion carved into his face. He didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't ask for anything. The orderlies who brought his meals noticed he barely touched the food, but he always said thank you. Quiet, polite, invisible, exactly the kind of patient the staff preferred. No trouble meant no attention, and no attention meant they could focus on the ones who screamed through the nights or try to pull out their IVs. The man in 217 didn't do any of that. He just sat there, hour after hour, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window. Dr. Brennan made his rounds on the third morning. He was young for a chief psychiatrist, confident in the way men are when they've never been truly wrong about anything that mattered. He flipped through the man's file as he walked, scanning the notes left by the night shift. Nonverbal, possible dissociative episode, unresponsive to standard questioning. Brennan had written those words himself about a dozen other veterans that month. He knocked once on the door to 217 and stepped inside without waiting for a response. The man didn't look up. Brennan sat down in the plastic chair across from the bed and clicked his pen. He asked the usual questions. Name, rank, what year is it? Where are you right now? The man's eyes shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the doctor's presence, but his mouth stayed closed. Brennan sighed and made a note in the chart. He'd seen this before, too. The ones who shut down completely. The ones who couldn't find their way back from wherever the war had left them. He stood up, told the man he'd check in again tomorrow, and left the room shaking his head. Another casualty. Another file to update with the same words he'd used 100 times before. What Brennan didn't see was the way the man's jaw tightened when the door clicked shut, or the way his hands, still resting on his knees, had curled just slightly into fists before releasing again. Small things. Things a tired doctor wouldn't notice. Things that didn't make it into the chart. The hospital's routine continued around him. Nurses swapped shifts. Orderlies wheeled carts down hallways. The man in 217 became part of the background, another body occupying another bed in another room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat. But on the fourth day, something changed. Not with him, with the hospital itself. It started with a phone call to the front desk, then another, then a third that made the receptionist sit up straighter and transfer the line directly to administration. Within an hour, the head of the facility was making calls of his own, voice tight, words clipped. Something was coming. Someone was coming. And nobody knew why. The staff noticed the tension first. The way their supervisors started moving faster, checking rooms, making sure everything was in order. One of the nurses asked what was going on, but all she got back was a sharp look and instructions to make sure the West Wing was spotless. She didn't ask again. You learn quickly in places like this that questions without answers meant something serious. Something above your pay grade. By early afternoon, 2 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Not ambulances. Not family vehicles. The kind of SUVs that didn't belong at a VA hospital on a quiet Wednesday. The kind that made the security guard at the front entrance stand a little straighter and stop scrolling on his phone. 4 men stepped out, all wearing dark suits, all moving with a kind of precision that made it clear they weren't civilians. One of them held a briefcase. Another spoke quietly into a radio clipped to his collar. They didn't check in at the desk. They didn't ask for directions. They walked straight toward the West Wing like they'd been there before. Dr. Brennan was in his office when his door opened without a knock. He looked up, irritated, ready to remind whoever it was about basic professional courtesy. But the words died in his throat when he saw the man standing in his doorway. Older, gray hair cut military short, 3 stars on his shoulder boards. A uniform so clean and pressed it looked like it had never been worn before, even though the ribbons on his chest told a different story. Brennan stood up too fast, his chair scraping against the floor. The general didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a soft, final click. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried the kind of weight that made it impossible to interrupt. He asked one question. Where is he? Brennan's mind raced, flipping through files, through patients, through every possible reason a 3-star general would walk into his hospital unannounced and ask about someone without using a name. He stammered something about patient privacy, about protocols, about needing more information. The general didn't blink. He repeated the question, slower this time, and Brennan understood immediately that this wasn't a conversation. This was an order. Room 217. The words came out quieter than Brennan intended. The general nodded once and turned toward the door. Brennan followed, heart pounding, mind spinning through every worst-case scenario he could imagine. Behind them, the men in suits fell into formation, silent, efficient, terrified in their composure. The hallway stretched longer than Brennan remembered. Every step echoed. Other staff members stopped what they were doing, pressed themselves against the walls, watched the procession move past with wide eyes and held breath. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. When they reached room 217, the general stopped. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He simply opened the door and stepped inside. The man on the bed looked up. For the first time in 4 days, his expression changed. Not shock, not surprise. Something quieter. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The general crossed the room in 3 strides and did something that made every person watching from the doorway forget how to breathe. He saluted. Sharp. Perfect. Held. The man on the bed stood slowly, and when he returned the salute, his posture shifted. The exhaustion was still there, carved into the lines of his face. But underneath it was something else. Something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the silence and the stillness. Authority. Command. The kind of presence that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. The general's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear enough to carry into the hallway. He used a name, a rank, colonel, and then he said something that made Dr. Brennan's stomach drop through the floor. He apologized for the delay, for the confusion, for the fact that it had taken 4 days to find him after the mission went dark. Mission. The word hung in the air like smoke. Brennan's eyes darted to the thin file he'd read a dozen times. The redacted sections he'd assumed were just standard trauma protocols. He understood now. Those weren't redactions for privacy. They were redactions for classification, national security, the kind of operations that didn't make it into medical charts because, officially, they didn't exist. The colonel, because that's what he was, what he'd always been, nodded once. He didn't explain, didn't justify. Men like him didn't owe explanations to people who hadn't earned the right to hear them. He simply gathered the few belongings he'd arrived with, a small duffel bag that had sat untouched in the corner for 4 days, and walked toward the door. The general stepped aside. The men in suits formed a corridor, and the colonel walked out of room 217 for the last time, moving with the steady, unshakable stride of someone who'd spent decades leading others into places most people couldn't survive. Dr. Brennan stood frozen in the hallway, watching them disappear toward the exit. His mind replayed every interaction, every assumption, every note he'd written in that file. Nonverbal, unresponsive, dissociative. He'd been so certain, so confident in his diagnosis. He'd seen what he expected to see and missed everything that actually mattered. One of the nurses approached slowly, voice barely above a whisper. She asked what had just happened. Brennan didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, he had no idea. He'd spent 4 days treating a decorated combat officer like just another broken patient, never once considering that silence wasn't the same as weakness, that stillness wasn't the same as defeat, that some men carried their wars quietly, not because they couldn't speak, but because the people around them weren't clear to hear what they'd say. The black SUVs pulled away from the hospital 30 minutes later. Inside, the colonel sat in silence, staring out the window at a world that looked exactly the same as it had 4 days ago, even though everything had changed. The general, sitting across from him, didn't push for conversation. Men who'd served together as long as they didn't need words to communicate. Some things were understood. Some debriefs happened in silence. Back at the hospital, Dr. Brennan sat at his desk, staring at the files still open in front of him. He picked up his pen 3 times and put it down 3 times without writing anything. What was there to say? What note could he possibly add that would capture what had just happened? In the end, he closed the file and locked it in his desk drawer. Some lessons he was learning didn't belong in medical charts. They belonged in the quiet spaces where confidence met humility and arrogance learned the price of assumption. The staff talked about it for weeks. The day the general came. The patient in 217 who wasn't really a patient at all. The moment everything they thought they knew turned out to be wrong. But eventually, like everything else in hospitals that run on routine and repetition, the story faded. New patients arrived. New files stacked up. New assumptions were made. Life moved on. But every now and then, when Dr. Brennan passed room 217, he slowed down, just for a second, just long enough to remember the man who sat in silence for 4 days while everyone around him decided who he was without ever asking. Just long enough to remember that competence doesn't always announce itself, that strength sometimes looks like stillness, and that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming you understand someone's story before they choose to tell it. If this story reminded you that respect isn't given based on appearances, hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me about a time someone underestimated you or someone you know. And if you want more stories about the moments when quiet strength speaks louder than words, subscribe because there are plenty more where this came from. The next one might just change how you see the world.